Alright, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good morning I bid to everyone. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim fil alamin innaka hamidun. First of all, I would like to thank you everyone for coming to this program by Center for Advanced Irfan Studies or Tradisi, a think tank based in Malaysia where our focus of research is on Islamic philosophy, particularly classical Islamic philosophy, focusing on Ibn Sina, Suhrawardi, and also Ibn Arabi. So today we are very grateful because we have here a great scholar, Professor Dr. Chanadi Dagli, which I believe that needs no further introduction, but I will read a bit of his biography. So Chana K. Dagli, please correct me if my pronunciation is wrong, Professor.
It's a Janer Dali.
Chana Dali.
Yes,
All right, okay. I am sorry for the wrong
not
pronunciation.
at all.
Thank you for the correction. Is an associate professor of religious studies at College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts. He is a general editor of the Study Quran and the author of Ibn Arabi and Islamic Intellectual Culture, as well as the current book that we are currently discussing, Metaphysical Institutions, Islam and the Modern Project. So Professor Chana Dali will be with us today to discuss about his book, and also we will be providing the platform for all of you to ask anything regarding his book in particular or Islamic philosophy in general. So without further ado, let us welcome Professor Chana Dali.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate those of you who are coming out in the morning in Malaysia. It's at night for us, but thanks to the wonders of technology, we're able to be together. It's a bit of a challenge for me to be able to speak about the book in short order, because I have attempted to cover quite a lot of ground. And so, of course, it'll be very difficult to summarize the argument of the book in an hour or two, never mind the time we have allotted. But I'm going to do my best to at least try to hit some of the themes. But what I'd like to do maybe is to say a few words about how the book came about, and why, or what some of the reasons are for why I wrote it. As a professor of Islamic studies, I'm sorry. As a professor of Islamic studies, you often encounter discussions in the field, not only in Islamic studies, but in related fields like anthropology, sociology, of course, history, and fields in the humanities and the social sciences that touch on Islam. Various kinds of discussions asking the question, well, what really is Islam in the first place? Or what does it mean to call something Islamic? What is normative Islam? Is there such a thing as Islam at all? These kinds of questions which seem to persist within the academic world, especially, and they're asked and answered in different kinds of ways. And they have been for a few decades at least. But this came to the fore, I would say about 10 years ago. A couple of things happened which really sorry. Sorry about that. Sorry for the interruption. There's a couple of sorry. Pardon me. I have to turn off the. Just give me 1 second. I apologize. I really apologize. I'm so sorry about that. It's just the time of day. It's sort of it caught me by surprise. Sorry, I have to mute this. Again, so about 10 years ago, within the last decade or so, uh, uh, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry about these interruptions. I managed to get it. Okay. Well, once again, two things happened which particularly inspired me to start thinking about these things in some kind of detail. One of them was an article which came out in the Atlantic magazine um, entitled "What ISIS Really Wants." And this article, one of the things that it did was to redefine, as it were, try to define what truly Islamic meant. And it had this infamous sentence, ISIS is Islamic, period, very Islamic, with an italic, sort of italicized very. And the entire article was premised on this idea of somehow that ISIS, the terrorist group, represented the true Islam. And I wrote a response to this, which the Atlantic magazine actually published. Around a little bit later than that, around the same time, a major book came out, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, by Shihab Ahmed, called "What is Islam?" with the subtitle "The Importance of Being Islamic." And this book generated a lot of attention within the field of Islamic studies. There were a lot of reviews, and a lot of people thought that this was the final, you might say, amongst the academics, I should say, people thought that this was the kind of the last word on the subject. He had finally shown that the way that we define define Islam can now be captured in his sort of new theory of this inherent contradiction of Islam, and showing how there's this much wider spectrum of Islam than we thought was there. But this book, and we can have a chance to talk about this, is really very deeply problematic. The ideas in it are, I would say, extremely, they're first of all incoherent, and they're misleading as relates to you might say, the substance of Islam. But I was motivated to sort of take a look not only at the book itself, but at the literature that was a response to it. And I began to write an article, which was a kind of a survey of some of the responses to this book and the whole "what is Islam" question. But then the further that I got into it, the further I realized that this whole area of study of looking at the question of what is Islam was really lacking in depth. It was lacking in philosophical rigor. It was lacking in analytical rigor. And the deeper I went into it, the more I started to research, and the more I started to ask questions about some of the background issues related to this whole "what is Islam" question. And so really, far from being a question within the narrow field of Islamic studies, for example, it's not only a question of who is the more representative Muslim or who is the standard Muslim, but really it opened up a whole, you might say, field, a whole set of questions that were philosophical in nature, related to the nature of religion, of culture, civilization, and these other terms, and more generally speaking, the very nature of shared consciousness itself. That is to say, when it comes to ultimate questions, how is it that human beings conceive of the way that they relate to each other, the way that they share thinking, the way that they exist in a community with each other in these realities that we call religions and cultures? And so this activity, this effort wound up turning into a book, because out of the effort to continue to try to address these various questions. The book has three main parts, and I'm going to talk about the first part in some detail. But the book has three main parts. The first part of the book has to do with the first part of the title, which is Metaphysical Institutions. And it's a long, and you might say it's quite an in-depth discussion of the nature of these realities that we call religions, cultures, civilizations, and traditions. Those four terms are very important in that regard. And what I do is create a sort of general rubric, a general conceptual rubric. And I say that these four terms are really different names that are given, in English, of course, that different names that are given to this general feature of our, you might say, conceptual space, right? They all exist in the same conceptual space. And I theorize this space using the concept of what I call a metaphysical institution. I'm gonna talk about what that is. So that's the first part of the book, talking about what are these things that we call religions and cultures. And then secondly, what do we mean when we talk about institutions? What are these things called institutions? How can we theorize them in a way that's actually analytically and logically rigorous? The second part of the book pertains to metaphysics itself. So if we can say that the first part of the book pertains to institutions of a certain kind, the second part of the book, part two, really refers to metaphysics. And I think one of the things that's important about this part of the book is that Muslim intellectuals in particular, really need to overcome the fragmentation where they discuss certain kinds of questions separate from the larger metaphysical picture. It's really past time that we stop doing this. We have to be able to discuss ultimate questions at the same time that we discuss other kinds of questions, because our forebears never really split up this space. In any case, part two really addresses what the metaphysical issues are that relate to our ability to properly conceive of Islam as a metaphysical institution. One of these is the nature or you might say is the metaphor, I should say, of structure, and how this metaphor of structure and the materialist worldview that it presupposes really permeates the way that we discuss and conceive of human beings thinking together, and some of the metaphysical problems with that idea. And I go into that in some kind of detail. There's 3 chapters there: the metaphysics of anti-dualism, the metaphysics of meaning, and the metaphysics of paradox. There's a lot to that, and we probably won't be able to get to it today. The last part of the book has to do with the subtitle, which is Islam in the Modern Project, and that is a discussion, you might say, of the ramifications of this of the proper conceptualization of the encounter between Islam and the modern project, and how it is that the modern project or modernity or modernism really falsely conceives of itself as a kind of universal practice that's not really anything akin to a religion the way that Islam is, and it sort of has a universalist self-image. But what I've tried to prove in the book up until then is that the modern project is itself, even though it might deny this reality, is itself a metaphysical institution. It is itself the kind of thing, for Muslims, you might say it's a false version of that thing, but they are the kind of thing that they are trying to critique. But the modern project sort of conceives of itself, or imagines itself to be not really an institution at all, but something above an institution, a kind of a meta institution, a metaphysical institution, a pure universalist practice. And in the chapters in that part of the book, I try to examine, the nature of that interaction, the nature of the encounter, and specifically in the final chapter before the conclusion, I survey some of the major examples of the way in which Western scholarship has tried to conceptualize Islam. So, you can see that there's actually quite a lot going on in the book. It's a multi-dimensional book, and it's really one long complex argument that I'm trying to establish the various pieces of, and to bring us to the conclusion of the book. But let's begin, if I can. We won't have much time to get into all of these, but I would like to talk a little bit about the first chapter or two and the main argument that I'm trying to present there. And here we come to the basic question of what people are talking about when they ask this question: what is Islam, or what is Islamic? Now, am I able to share screen?
Yes, I will make you as the co-host. Wait. All right, you may share your
Thank you
screen.
very much.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Now, in the book, at the end of each chapter, I have these little synopsis, kind of synopsis of the major points of this, and this is a version of that you can find online, but it's also a good for starting with discussion. So, the way the book begins is by saying that the primary terms used to define Islam conceptually are religion, civilization, culture, and tradition. One or more members of this tetrad, meaning this group of four, remain ultimate in all significant conceptualizations of Islam. And what I mean by that is that when one surveys the literature, so if, for example, in the case of in the case of Talal Asad, I'm sorry, he calls Islam a discursive tradition. In the case of someone like Marshall Hodgson, he speaks about Islam in terms of being a civilization or a religion, and he also uses the other terms as well. And in all of the, you might say, the attempts to define Islam and to talk about what is Islamic, these four ideas, these four terms always pop up. They're always, you might say, the first go-to, you might say, terms in order to be able to clarify what Islam is. Now, the problem with that is that in the case of the fields, the several fields of study that have been devoted to these terms, they don't have an agreed upon definition, neither on their own nor in relation to each other. And this is a quite astonishing state of affairs, and it's not a new state of affairs either. Part of what I do in the first chapter is to survey the literature on each of these terms in religious studies, the nature of religion, in what you can call civilization studies, the definition of civilization and culture and tradition. And what you find going back at least 50 years, and actually more like a century in each case, is that there's a constant refrain in the literature that says we don't really have a good definition for religion, or we don't really have a good definition for civilization and culture, tradition, and so forth and so on. There's a book written in the 1940s, for example, on the question of culture that literally catalogs in 1947 hundreds of definitions for culture, hundreds of definitions for culture. So you have Islam, the thing that you're trying to define, but you're defining it in terms of entities or in terms of realities, which themselves don't really have a definition. They don't really have a definition. Now, but as I say, the next point is that a lack of formal definitions for important ideas is not intrinsically wrong, and in a sense is inevitable. But the problem is not in terms not having precise definitions. It's very possible to have to be able to understand a lot about a subject matter. It's very possible to have an expertise and, in fact, a mastery over a subject matter, but not being able to define all of the terms of your subject matter when called upon to do so. This is very natural. There's nothing, that doesn't mean that you don't know what you're talking about. However, in the case of Islam, these terms are not only they're ambiguous, but then they're being called upon to clarify the nature of something else. That is to say, we don't know what religion and civilization and culture are. We can't really articulate them. They don't have a really agreed upon definition. The problem is not that they don't have a definition. They have too many definitions. And so we have these realities which we define Islam in terms of in the academy, I should say. But then these things themselves don't have an agreed upon definition. And so to say that Islam is some aspect of Islam is religious here and is cultural there doesn't really rely upon or result from a clear conception of what we mean by religion or what we mean by culture, but it really it really relies upon a kind of a sense of I know it when I see it. And so when academic scholars talk about Islam as being some practice or some idea being religious versus cultural, what they're really doing is they're relying on their own sense and their kind of own internalized sense of what those terms mean. But those terms don't have what I would call an analytical or theoretical character. So the idea is that religion, civilization, culture, and tradition remain what I call folk concepts. That is to say, they're idiomatic ideas. They're very rich folk concepts, no doubt. But they nevertheless remain ideas where you have to rely upon the intuition or the sense of the people who use these terms in order to get to some kind of definition of them. let me give you an example of some of the problems that can arise with this. I'm going to show you a different image. So I'm sorry, hold on. Apologies. Uh, uh, can you all see the three circles? Is that showing up?
Yes, can
Yeah,
see.
okay. Yeah. So here is a Venn diagram of some of the issues that are involved here. If you take some of the various realities that could possibly be classified as being part of Islam, prophethood, ethics, lullabies, art, law, carpet weaving. These are just some examples of things where a scholar who's looking at Islam would classify them as being part of one category or the other. So a person would say, well, ship making is not really religious, it's really part of Islamic civilization. Or carpet weaving is not really, let's say law is not really part of culture, but it's really part of civilization. There's the various ways of classifying these realities. Now, here, what I mean by placing this here is that it would probably be universally agreed upon that if you had to slot prophethood into one of the three categories, you would put it in the category of religion. If it was lullabies, you'd place it in culture, and ship making, probably most scholars would place it in the category of civilization. However, when it comes to some other things, they might correctly go into more than one category. So ethics can be either a cultural phenomenon or a religious phenomenon, depending on the scholar that you're asking. Law can either be civilizational or religious. And art could really be part of any one of these. You could properly speak of Islamic art and classify it as a cultural or a religious or a civilizational phenomenon. Now, the problem with this ambiguity, the fact that in some cases some terms are unequivocally religious, in some cases ambiguously, and in some cases they can belong to any category at all, depending on the scholar who's talking about it. The problem with this is that there's no set definitions, there's no set rules. And what it does is it doesn't really help us to define these realities at all. All this does, all the practice of calling something religious or cultural or civilizational does, or traditional, all it does is register the opinion of the scholar who is studying that particular subject matter. But objectively speaking, as a matter of theory and as a matter of analysis, we don't have any way of being able to say whether something belongs in one category or the other. And so we're presented with a situation in which people are pronouncing on whether or not something is Islamic or not, or they're defining Islam as a religion or as a culture, or as a civilization, but it's being done entirely on the basis of folk terms and idiomatic senses, or you might say a kind of intuitions on the part of the scholar who says, look, I know religion when I see it, and I know culture when I see it. But the problem, what's astonishing about the situation is that if you look at the scholarship about these terms over the last 50, 75 to 100 years, people have not been able to come to a consensus about what these terms mean. If you're going to use terms to be able to analyze and make clear other terms, those terms have to be at least as clear as the terms you're trying to define. So one of the examples I use in the book is, in the old philosophical definition of man or human being as rational animal. If you're going to define human being as a rational animal, your idea of rational and animal need to be as clear enough. They need to be clearer than your sense of man if that definition is going to shed any light. And in the case of Islam, this is not the situation that we have. So what do we do about this? Well, one of the things that we can do about this is to try to impose or to try and create a kind of an analytical framework such that when we use these terms, religion and civilization and culture and tradition, in other words, these things that we say Islam is one of these, it can be interpreted as one of these things. If we can come up with an analytical framework to overcome some of the definitional difficulties, then we would have made some kind of progress and maybe perhaps avoided some of the ambiguities. And my solution to this, or my at least partial solution to this, is this concept of the metaphysical institution. Now, one of the things I was surprised by when I was looking at this was to find that this word institution itself, which I hadn't really seriously looked at before, that the word institution itself is also, you might say, suffers from the same definitional confusion that these other terms have. People use the word institution all the time. It's a major term within sociology. But then when you look at the literature, you discover that we sort of don't know exactly how to define it. It doesn't really have the kind of analytical power that people wanted to have. And again, we're caught in a situation of, look, we know it when we see it. And again, it doesn't mean, and I want to be very careful here, when I say that people don't have a definition for religion, it doesn't mean that scholars of religious studies don't know what they're talking about. They're very erudite and learned in many cases. And the same thing for historians or anthropologists when it comes to civilization and culture. And when it comes to sociologists looking at institutions, yes, they've classified all the different kinds of institutions. There's incredible work that's done in the field. But what I'm noting is, you might say, a formal problem. That is to say, the lack of a good, consistent, formal definition. And the fact that there's an absence of such a definition itself points to an interesting problem, I would say. And so my approach in the book is to say, let's conceive of these realities, these gigantic human realities that we call religions and cultures. Let's conceive of the space in which they exist using this idea of the institution, and specifically using this new idea of the metaphysical institution. Now, this is new because in relation, if you look up institutions, if you look at the literature on institutions, there's usually a group of them which are considered to be the standard institutions within society. Religion is one of them, but that's very narrowly conceived. Family, education, government, etc. There's a sort of a group of these which is taken to be standard. But I think that the idea of institutions at the ultimate level has actually not been well theorized. And what I try to do is to offer and to develop and to refine not just a kind of a description, or you might say not to just take these four terms and lump them together into one group, but to actually offer a rigorous theoretical framework for being able to understand what these things called metaphysical institutions are. The second chapter of the book really gets into the details of this, and I'm not able to, you might say, get in. I can't. It's quite a long and a complex chapter, but perhaps I can give a brief sense or kind of a brief preview of the direction that I took it in, and I can show you and just share the screen again, and to give you the definition that I'm actually do it this way. Now, what I do is I try to offer three different definitions of what an institution is, and by extension, what a metaphysical institution is, and then combine those three into a more complete and complex definition, which nevertheless doesn't become overly complicated. The first of these definitions is that an institution, and again, this would include a religion or a culture or a civilization, is an instance of shared thinking in a relationship of community, practice, and legacy. So this, you might say, is the first triad, the first, and consists of the first third of the definition which I offer. So an institution is an instance of shared thinking in a relationship of community, practice, and legacy. What do I mean by these things? And so, the brief definition we have is here. The community is a group of people defined by those who, being those who know the right things and do things the right way. A practice is defined by inheriting and bequeathing the right things and being carried out by the right people. And a legacy is bequeathed and inherited by the right group of people doing things the right way. Now, that sounds very abstract, but let me give a concrete example of this. If we think of the institution of modern science, we call science an institution, the institution of modern science. The community, in that case, is the scientists, the scientific community, the people who are those that we entrust with the moral authority to be able to arbitrate what counts as correct practice and what counts as correct scientific knowledge. They're the community. Scientific practice in this sense is the right way of being a scientist, what we can call, using a shorthand, scientific method, right? That is to say, the way to do things scientifically. That's what I use the word practice to describe. The scientific legacy is the knowledge that the scientists are supposed to possess, and which is the input into scientific methodology and is also the output of scientific practice. And so these three things relate to each other in a coherent way, in a sense, the same way that you might say the three dimensions of space always go together. So the community is determined by a practice and a legacy. The practice is determined by a legacy and a community, and the legacy is determined by a community and a practice. These three exist as a kind of an irreducible whole, right? And so from one point of view, you can think of an institution in terms of the people who are in it, in terms of the way that things are done, and in terms of the knowledge and other things, and the knowledge and um, uh, uh, the knowledge and the that which is inherited and bequeathed, which gets passed between people and along. All right, so that's the first of the triads. Secondly, I say an institution is an instance of shared thinking, which is characterized. I'm sorry. The second of the triads is an institution is an instance of shared thinking characterized by stability, dynamism, and purpose. That is to say, if you're going to have an institution, the institution has to be characterized by a certain degree of constancy. If something is constantly changing, if something is different tomorrow completely than it is today, then you can't call it an institution. It's something else. It has to also but also it has to be characterized by a certain kind of dynamism and creativity. Can't have an institution that can survive over any long period of time unless it's able to change and respond and adapt. And similarly, institutions are defined by their purpose. For example, in the case of a college or university, they often have a mission statement, something like that, the idea of what the institution is for. And for complex reasons, we can get into this, but this stability, this dynamism, and this purpose always presuppose each other, right? So a second definition, second partial definition, institution is an instance of shared thinking characterized by stability, dynamism, and purpose. And then finally, the third definition is that an institution is an instance of shared thinking constituted by accounts, heuristics, and norms. Now here, this is a little bit complicated, but just in kind of briefly speaking, an account is something like the things that are known, right? The institutions know what or know that. It's facts, it's premises, it's axiom. Heuristics is a technical term I'm using to describe the methods and the procedures and the rules and the recipes and the kind of the if-then aspect of an institution. It's know-how, how to do things, how to get from this to there. And then the norm, a norm is an expression which includes values and standards and goals and purposes and exemplars and objectives and so forth and so on. There's an analogy that I use of a journey, but I think I'm short on time, so I don't want to get into that. And now, part of my claim is that each of these three definitions of an institution make a certain kind of sense on their own, right? To describe this reality as being constituted by a community, a practice, and a legacy has a certain wholeness to it. And the same thing with stability, purpose, and dynamism. And the same thing with norms, heuristics, and accounts. But that one of the things that this model is capable of doing is to combine all of these together in a way that makes the model more complex, but which also doesn't lead to a degree of confusion and conflation and messiness in terms of the way that the definition works. In other words, my claim is that this multidimensional model is complex, it's coherent, it demarcates the relevant domain, and it can scale from simple to complex. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because one of the problems, or more than one of the problems with the existing definitions that we have for religion, for culture, for civilization, is that some of them are sort of pithy, and even you might say quasi-poetic in their nature, right? You have a definition of religion which has a kind of an emotive quality to it. It's simple, but because of its simplicity, it doesn't really have a lot of analytical power. Other definitions tend to be extremely long and complex, and the terms of the definition are actually quite messy and ambiguous in relationship to each other. That is to say, you have a definition that's maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs long, and there's a proliferation of words in there, and you're not exactly clear about how these different terms relate to each other. Each of them seem to rely upon a kind of idiomatic sense of, what we mean by values or customs or capacities and so forth and so on. And there's dozens of terms that show up in these definitions which themselves are not really well defined. And thirdly, when it comes to some of these definitions or these conceptions of what religions and cultures and civilizations are, you have a kind of a long laundry list of things. Like, so for example, you have values, but also practices, and also artifacts, and also there's a kind of a long list of these things. And then when you look at this list and these definitions and these conceptualizations of Islam or of other religions, you ask yourself, just wait a second, what is it that makes all of these realities go together? How is it that you can bundle this particular set of realities into a thing that you're going to call a culture? In other words, what is the ontological glue that holds together this reality you're calling a religion, this reality you're calling a culture? In many cases, it's really nothing more than the religious studies scholar or the anthropologist or the sociologist looking at, sort of coming to the question with his or her own sense of what this is, and then trying to make a laundry list of all the things that he or she thinks goes into that category. But this is not analytically helpful. Again, it usually winds up being a way in which the religious studies scholar, in the case of religion, wants to call certain things religious and wants to call other things not religious, and he crafts a definition that fits with that intuition, but it doesn't have any analytical power. It can't help anyone else come up with a way of classifying or demarcating things as religious or not. We're all caught in this kind of idiomatic folk sense of these various terms. Now, what I think the model that I develop in the book, at least I think it accomplishes, or it gets us closer to it, is to be able to precisely demarcate the terms that are part of the definition, that are part of the model, such that none of these terms are ambiguous in relationship to each other. They all fit together metaphysically, you might say. They all fit together ontologically. And the model is complex enough where it's able to address and to deal with not only a sort of a limited aspect of Islam as a religion or as a culture, but to deal with things at a pretty high level of complexity, but without sacrificing its clarity and its coherence. I think how am I doing on time? I think I've gotten actually close. Hello?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just got back from the toilet. So I believe that if you have end your discussion, we can proceed to the
Well, so
Q&A.
that's basically what I did. Was a discussion that was a kind of a quick summary
Right?
of the first part of the book. That is to say, this idea of the problem of what kind of thing is Islam, and then the solution, the constructive solution that I try to offer for it. Then the next part really gets into, we can get into it if you like, the metaphysics that underlies these issues, you might say. But that's maybe a good place to pause, and I'm happy to have a discussion and questions or anything you like.
Yeah. We will be opening the floor for any questions. So you can For the audience, you can open your mic and ask directly, or you may write your questions down in the chat section and I will read it out to the speaker. Okay, we have three questions here, Professor Dali,
Please.
by Shazrin. So here, I will read it one by one. First question, does mysticism have any impacts on social dynamics? I believe this is something in for Islamic philosophy in general.
So does mysticism impact social dynamics?
Yes, that is the first question.
Uh-huh.
Secondly, what is the difference between mysticism and also meta-mysticism? And the third question, does the concept of light in the Islamic philosophy have any role in constructing the metaphysical institutions?
Light or life?
Light, nur.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, I tend to follow Professor William Chittick in having a little bit. I sort of try to avoid using the word mysticism because it doesn't really map well onto any particular idea within the Islamic world. Of course, Islam has that which is the equivalent of mysticism, but it tends to be simplistic and reductive. Now, if one means by mysticism tasawwuf, then that's something else. That is to say, if you're talking about the spiritual life or the spiritual path in Islam and its relationship to social reality. I'm sorry, how was the question? Was the question, how does mysticism relate to social practice? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Social dynamics.
Social dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an there's a lot of ways of answering that question, I would say. I think it depends a lot upon the locality that you're speaking about. Um, Tasawwuf, for example, has a certain social or has had a certain social role within the community. For example, think of in Turkey, the Sufi orders, the spiritual masters, their teachings, the way they permeate society. That's something that could be studied empirically and historically, and which would not be exactly the same as those same realities, let's say in Egypt, or the same way in India. So, let's say the social impact of Sufism in India might be similar to the impact in Istanbul or let's say in Bosnia, but not identical. But although there would be some kind of overlapping, there would be some similarities. So I think probably one fairly common feature of that would be the um, the fact that Sufism, or again tasawwuf, whatever name you want to call this reality, tended to have more of a connection with the common people, if I can put it that way, than let's say Islamic philosophy or kalam or Islamic theology. And so you would have only a relatively small number of people who would be able to really understand anything written by the mutakallimun, by the theologians or by the philosophers. But if you look at the poetry of Maulana Rumi or many, many other poets that you can find in the South, in the subcontinent and in your own part of the world, which I don't know as well, in Southeast Asia, the Sufis would have had a kind of distinct social impact that that would be pretty widespread in comparison to the impact of the other communities of, let's say, inquiry into the nature of ultimate questions. So I think, as a general question, yes, it has always been an important part of the social fabric of Islamic civilization, but it would change. It would be different from place to place, and even in the same country, it would be different in a city than it would be in a village. And so that's more of an empirical question. The second question had to do with what was mysticism and meta-mysticism.
The
I don't
difference.
know what I've never, I'll be honest, I haven't heard of that term before, so I probably don't know how to answer it.
Okay.
And then the third question was, pardon me, I forgot the third.
Does the concept of nur or light in the Islamic
Uh,
philosophy have any role in constructing the metaphysical institutions?
uh, no, not directly, because this work that I've done, it addresses what I would call a meaningful minimum like a meaningful minimum of metaphysics. So I try to discuss just enough metaphysics in order to be able to show that, in other words, the minimum amount necessary to be able to make some kind of sense out of institutions. But what is not present here is a total metaphysics. And in fact, one of the important things that we have to do when we talk about social reality and when we talk about human interaction is that we have to be able to demarcate what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. So one mistake that we can make is to say, for example, that human beings are, in a sense, nothing more than their interactions with each other. And so there's a kind of a reduction whereby, let's say, our culture, our language, the so-called structure of society is you might say determines our consciousness. It determines what we are. And so there's a kind of a collapse whereby our consciousness is really nothing more than our interactions with people. So that's an error that needs to be avoided. And so one of the things that I try to do in the book is to say, look, you cannot reduce human beings to their interactions with each other in this kind of mechanical, deterministic way. Human beings have a soul. Human beings, that whatever you want to call this reality, there's something that is not the kind of reductive, materialist, what I call anti-dualist conception of human beings. However, it's also the case that the totality of what you can call consciousness, the spirit, the intellect, is not exhausted by this reality I'm calling the reality of shared thinking. That is to say, the domain in which institutions exist. So human beings think, we have forms, we have meaning, and in this domain of shared thinking in an institution, that's a very important part of what it is to be a human being. But it doesn't exhaust that inner reality of what a human being is, right? So I also don't want to make the mistake of somehow collapsing consciousness itself or any of the metaphors that are used for it, like light, like spirit, even in the case of others like love, you know, and so these kind of the larger ontological basis of our knowledge and of our consciousness. But the idea of the institution or the space of what I'm calling shared thinking, this kind of where these forms exist, is sort of in between bodies, and then also the fuller domain of the fuller reality of consciousness itself. So that's a way of saying, in a long-winded way, that you might say, when I theorize what a religion is, or what shared thinking is, I'm presupposing, as a Muslim, something like the metaphysics of light, or you can call it the metaphysics of love, or the metaphysics of wujud, whatever the school of thought that you're thinking about. But that doesn't directly come into the theorizing of this particular subject, which is somewhat, you might say, it's constrained to a certain scope, right? You can't just talk about everything, if that makes any sense. Okay.
Okay, we have here 3 questions in the chat section, in the comment
Mhm.
section by Nuruddin. So I will read it to you, the first question first, Professor Dali.
Mhm.
Prof, is the idea of the metaphysical institution parallel to the concept of worldview as a supercluster or clusters of concepts, or is it like Kant's or Kuhn's paradigm concept?
Um, no, an institution is not the same thing as a paradigm or a worldview. Um, it's a little bit more mysterious than that. And part of what part of the point that I try to make is that one of the difficulties of conceiving of these things that we call religions and cultures and civilizations is that they're irreducibly complex in a way. So a worldview or a paradigm does not just exist sort of floating in the air on its own. A worldview or a paradigm has to have the authoritative community that determines what counts as part of that paradigm and what doesn't. So, for example, Kuhn talks about the change from Newtonian mechanics to relativity, and about how the terms change and the entire, not just this particular idea or that particular idea, but the whole picture changes. But that change in what he's calling a paradigm presupposes an authoritative community whose role it is to act as the final arbiters as to what counts, for example, in the case of Newtonian mechanics, what counts as space, what counts as time, what counts as force, who defines the terms. If I come along and I try and redefine the terms, they would say, well, you're not part of the authoritative community that who gets to say what these things are. So there are ideas, yes. There's a kind of a worldview, yes. But that worldview has a community of authority who we implicitly or explicitly rely upon in order to be able to differentiate a true version of it from a false version of it. And so a metaphysical institution is not so much a particular worldview, but it's an instance of shared thinking. It's a way in which people think together about matters of ultimate concern, about matters of ultimately what is real, about what is rational, about what is right? The expression of the answers to ultimate questions. And so it's related to the notion of a worldview, or related to the idea of a paradigm, but it's greater than that, right? It includes paradigms and worldviews, but it's not reducible to it. One of the things I say for example, in the book is that, like, for example, Islam has a system, but it is not reducible to being a system, right? So that's an important difference to make. Institutions have systems, that is to say, systems of thinking, which is what a paradigm is, but they're not reducible to that, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense.
All right. So the next question, also by Nuruddin. In the concluding chapter, the sighted man and the elephant, does it mean that our picture of Islam will not be complete, that we need some kind of illumination so that we can understand it completely?
No, I would say that this book does not call upon anyone to have this is really the book itself I presuppose other realities, but the book itself on purpose constrains itself to what you might call concepts and logic. That is to say, the point is to clarify the nature of the arguments, the nature of the ideas. And I think it can be understood outside of any sort of illumination. The metaphor of the sighted man and the elephant has more to do with the question of it acts as a kind of a mnemonic device for remembering what some of the issues are that are involved. And so, for example, if the sighted people, for example, instead of feeling, let's say, the elephant's trunk, they see the elephant's trunk and thereby know that that there must be the remainder of the elephant. And the sighted men are able to say this is an elephantine foot. But then the question becomes, what do we mean by elephantine? What does that word even mean? So it's the whole purpose of that metaphor is to take a familiar kind of image and then put a little bit of a twist on it so that it can function as a kind of you might say just as a kind of a metaphor or a kind of a mnemonic device for thinking about the whole of the book. But in short, no, it wouldn't require. I would say the book itself, beyond, let's say, accepting that there's more to the world than what we usually think of as the material, is more of a demand for clear logical thinking as opposed to any kind of illumination.
Also, the next question by Nuruddin. Regarding the concept of metaphysical institution, does it mean that Islam can be understood based on various existing metaphysical systems? For example, someone who approaches Islam from a Western modern metaphysical institution will be different from a non-Western metaphysical institution.
Uh, the question is a little bit hard to answer in its existing form. I would say that one of the themes in the latter part of the book is that part of the mistake, one of the mistakes that's often made in the modern project, is that it conceives that the people who study Islam, which I'm saying can be classified as a metaphysical institution. It's not reducible to that, but it can be classified as one. That it's studied by people who themselves often don't realize that they themselves are operating within their own metaphysical institution. And what goes along with that is, of course, their own reliance upon authority, their own reliance upon dogma, their own reliance upon the what you can call the tradition from which they come. And so a person might think that they're looking at Islam in some kind of detached, unencumbered way where they're not bringing in any assumptions and they're not relying upon any kind of presuppositions. But no human being can study or encounter a reality like Islam unless they have themselves been raised and cultivated and developed within an institutional setting that tells them and has taught them throughout their lives what is ultimately real, what is ultimately rational, what is ultimately good. No one appears sort of full grown on earth as a kind of angelic reality, understanding and thinking about these things. We all have to be grown. We all have to be raised within our own setting. And the fact that someone might not be willing to admit that they're coming to Islam from within their own metaphysical institution doesn't change the fact that they are. And so it's not so much that Islam can be understood from within another metaphysical system. Islam can only be even thought about from within another metaphysical system. In other words, a person always has a metaphysics. They always have a set of answers to ultimate questions that they already possess, whether they're aware of it or not. And it's really only on the basis that they can even begin to ask questions and even inquire about a reality like Islam. That's one of the major assertions of the book. And I think it's an important point.
Okay, I believe that this is the last question for today because no one has sent any questions after this. Victor Gunn, he asks you, Professor Dali, I remember being struck by your reference to Nuya concept of Quranization of memory when speaking with you after a panel on the study Quran some time ago in the US. Does this play a part in your continued thinking on this?
Uh, well, not Nuia's ideas, but of course the reality that he was talking about, yes. So, for example, um, one of the ways in which Islam um, is able to communicate and transmit teachings about the good, about what it means to be a good human being, is not only within the law, it's not only within theology, but also within tasawwuf, within Sufism. And the main concept by which Sufism, you might say, evaluates and judges the quality of human beings come from the Quran. And so when you look at the various states and stations that the Sufis talk about, for example, like there's the great book of Ansari, Sad Maidan, the 100 Fields, and its Arabic version, what's the title? I think manazil as-sa'ir, no, I'm forgetting right now. But the idea of you have these dozens of stations and descriptions of the virtues, and these come from the Quran. And so you might say one of the major features of Islam as a instance of shared thinking, as an instance of shared thinking, in relationship of community practice and legacy, characterized by stability, purpose, and dynamism, constituted by norms, accounts, and heuristics. These virtues and these concepts that come from the Quran are the very substance, right there. For example, in the case of that definition, they are the norms and the heuristics. They tell us, they're the substance of the practice of what it means to be a good Muslim. It's a way of conceiving of the virtues and conceiving of the ultimate good. And so, yes, the idea of the Quranic virtues and the way that the Quran, and not only the virtues, but also the way the Quran helps us to understand rationality and the nature of reality itself. I mean, there's no such thing as Islam without that. And if one is speaking about Islam as a metaphysical institution, then of course that's definitely a part of it. Now, by the way, I want to make a clarification here, because I think what often can happen is that it's not so much that I'm saying Islam, we should think of it as this thing called a metaphysical institution. What I'm saying is that we can think of our conceptual space, right? We can think of this, that are in our conceptual space, we have all these kind of institutions that we think about in life. And my assertion in the book is that this institutional space, this way that human beings relate to each other in community practice and legacy and so forth and so on, also extends to matters of ultimate questions. But because we have poorly theorized and poorly analyzed that space of ultimate questions and the way that human beings relate to each other, we have, instead of a good solid term that means the same thing in all cases, we have a kind of a hodgepodge of terms, a religion, a civilization, and so forth and so on. And because of that, we need to sort of bring in a term of a kind of a more theoretically rigorous idea. But it's not so much that I'm saying understand Islam or religion or tradition as a metaphysical institution. It's more like understand the space of metaphysical institutions as religion or as civilization. Maybe that doesn't add a whole lot of clarification, but it's a point that I wanted to sort of make. Anyway.
All right, I believe that there is no more question. So I would like to thank Professor Dagli for your willingness to be with us today. It is such a great opportunity to be interacting with you and talking about your new book, Metaphysical Institutions. I will put the link to buy your book in the comment section. For those who wanted to get the book, you can get it from the link through the States or University of New York Press official website. So for all the audiences, as a representative of Tradisi, I would like to thank you for coming here today. And for all of you, including Professor Dali, I am sorry and wanted to apologize if there are any shortcomings throughout this program. So we have recorded the whole program. So if you wanted to rewatch, you can scroll through our YouTube channel, Tradisi. I will put the link in the comment section too. And you may also look at our videos. We have interviewed William Chittick. We have also interviewed James Morris. We have talked with Alexander Nish, and so on and so forth. However, we also have a new program in this upcoming October, talking about Avicenna's modal metaphysics, which I believe that you would be interested to join. And also, please follow our Facebook, because we will be posting our programs more there, and also including the recording for this program. Thank you, everyone, and sorry. I have put the link in the comment section. you can scroll through our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone, and sorry if there are any shortcomings. Thank you also, Professor Dali.
Thank you. Thank
Assalamualaikum
you very much.
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.